Right now, whatever you did this morning, you almost certainly clocked in somewhere, checked a schedule, or answered to somebody. For nearly the entire span of human existence, none of that existed. No job titles, no shifts, no performance reviews. For roughly 290,000 years, our species had no bosses, no paychecks, and no such thing as being late for anything. So, what actually filled that enormous stretch of time instead? The truth turns out to be stranger and considerably more comfortable than most people ever assume. Let's clear up the biggest misconception immediately. Early humans were not sitting around half starved, clawing at roots every waking hour just to survive until tomorrow. That image, the desperate caveman in constant crisis, comes almost entirely from assumption rather than actual evidence, an image later civilizations found convenient to believe precisely because it made their own arrangement look like an improvement by comparison. Nobody had a title. Nobody introduced themselves by their occupation, because occupation as a fixed category barely existed. People did whatever the day required, and once it was handled, the day was theirs again, to spend however they actually wanted. That single distinction, no fixed role, no assigned duty waiting on a schedule, turns out to matter far more than it first sounds, because it reframes almost everything people casually assume about how our species actually spent its earliest, longest chapter, and the record left behind runs squarely against the popular assumption once you actually go looking at it directly. It also raises a fair question worth holding on to as we go. If a full working day was never actually required to keep a group of people alive and reasonably well fed, then the eventual arrival of something resembling a full working day was clearly not driven by pure survival necessity at all. Something else entirely had to be doing that work instead, and figuring out exactly what that something was turns out to explain a great deal about how we all ended up living, working, and scheduling our lives the way we do right now, whether we ever consciously agreed to any of it or not. If uncovering what history actually got wrong is why you keep coming back to channels like this one, subscribing just means the next one lands in front of you automatically. The clearest evidence for this comes from decades of fieldwork among the Jew, hoansi San people, sometimes called the Kung San, who live along the border region between Botswana and Namibia and who, until fairly recently, still practiced a foraging lifestyle close to how our distant ancestors likely lived. In the 1960s, anthropologist Richard Lee spent extended periods living directly among Jew, hoansi communities, tracking exactly how they spent their days, rather than guessing from a distance. What he documented surprised almost everyone in his field at the time. Adults spent, on average, somewhere between 12 and 19 hours per week on actual subsistence activity, meaning the hunting, gathering, and food processing required to keep everyone fed. That is not a typo, and it is not a cherry picked good week. It holds up as a rough average across his recorded observations. The remainder of their waking hours went toward visiting relatives, resting in the shade during the hottest part of the day, telling long, elaborate stories passed down across generations, and simply existing without anyone demanding productivity from them. Lee tracked more than just hours, too. He also logged the actual caloric return people brought home relative to the time invested getting it, and found that hoansi foragers were regularly bringing in more calories per hour of effort than most people would casually assume possible from a lifestyle without agriculture, stored grain, or livestock of any kind. It was not an economy running on the edge of collapse. It was, by his own measured numbers, a genuinely workable and fairly efficient way to keep an entire community fed without demanding anywhere near a full working day from any single adult in it. Lee's fieldwork became the foundation for an argument anthropologist Marshall Sahlins made famous in his 1972 book, Stone Age Economics. Sahlins called foraging societies like the Jew, hoansi, the original affluent society, and he meant that phrase quite literally, not ironically. Affluence, he argued, does not have to mean having more. It can also mean wanting less. And having enough time left over once your actual needs are met, that scarcity simply stops being the organizing force in your life. A forager with few possessions and modest needs can be materially freer than someone surrounded by belongings, but chained to the hours required to keep paying for all of them. Sahlins was directly pushing back against a much older assumption, one traceable all the way to philosopher Thomas Hobbes, that life without settled civilization must have been uniformly brutal and short, out of sheer material desperation. The actual field data available by the time Sahlins was writing simply did not support that inherited assumption, and he said so plainly. Sahlins was not describing paradise. Foraging life carried real risks, from injury to unpredictable seasons, and infant mortality in particular remained a serious concern in ways modern life has since mostly eliminated through medicine. But it was not the exhausting, constant scramble that later cultures assumed it must have been, and the data Lee collected backed that argument up directly, rather than leaving it as pure theory. Set that against how the average working adult spends a week today, and the comparison gets uncomfortable fast. Add up a standard job, the commute on either side of it, the unpaid hour or two most people quietly give back checking messages after dinner, and you are well past 40 hours before any actual rest even begins. 12 to 19 hours of required labor per week looks less like some obsolete, backward way of living, and more like an arrangement plenty of modern people would happily trade for if it were still on the table anywhere. It is worth pausing on why it no longer is, since the honest answer has very little to do with necessity, and a great deal to do with how thoroughly the intervening centuries restructured what counts as a normal, expected relationship between a person and their own time. So, if foraging required so little of people's actual time, why did anyone ever give it up? The honest answer is that farming, which began taking hold roughly 12,000 years ago in various regions independently, was not adopted because it made life easier. It was adopted because it could support far more people living in one fixed place. And once that trade was made, there was rarely a clean way back. Farming does not pause. Crops need constant tending, protection from animals, storage that has to be defended, and labor that shows up every single day regardless of how anyone feels that morning. A field does not care whether you are tired. The skeletons left behind tell an unusually direct story about what that shift actually cost people physically. Researchers Mark Nathan Cohen and George Armalago spent years comparing skeletal remains from populations before and after the transition to farming across multiple regions. And their findings, published in the influential collection Paleopathology at the Origins of Agriculture, showed a consistent physical decline rather than an improvement. Early farming populations showed more enamel hypoplasia, meaning visible growth disruption lines in tooth enamel that form specifically during periods of malnutrition or serious illness in childhood. Average stature dropped in several of the populations studied, a change bioarchaeologists generally read as a marker of sustained nutritional stress carried across childhood development rather than a coincidence. Signs of iron deficiency, evident in porous lesions on the skull that specialists call cribra orbitalia, and markers of infectious disease became more common, not less, likely tied to living in denser, more permanent settlements alongside stored grain, accumulated waste, and domesticated animals in close daily proximity. Cohen and Armalagos also found evidence that skeletal indicators of chronic physical labor, degenerative joint changes consistent with repetitive strain, increased noticeably in farming populations compared to the foragers who came directly before them in the same regions. Farming fed more mouths in total, but it did not necessarily feed any single one of them better, and it demanded far more sustained physical labor on a far more repetitive daily schedule. In exchange for that trade, once you are farming, you also cannot simply walk away when conditions turn bad. The way a foraging band, unencumbered by permanent structures or buried grain stores, could relocate toward better resources whenever a season simply stopped cooperating. Fields represent months of invested labor. Permanent shelters represent real effort to build. Leaving means abandoning both. That single fact changed everything about how people related to land and to each other. Foraging bands generally could not accumulate much of anything, since carrying surplus possessions across constant movement made little practical sense. Farming reversed that completely. Grain could be stored. Land could be claimed and defended. And once storage and claims to land became possible, some households inevitably ended up with more stored grain and better land than others, creating a kind of material inequality that simply had no real foothold in a mobile foraging life. From there, specialization followed almost automatically. In a foraging band, nearly everyone could do nearly everything required to survive, since survival depended on flexible, shared skill rather than narrow expertise. Settled farming populations, supporting larger and denser communities, could support people who did only one specific thing all day, every day, because surplus grain from others effectively fed them while they worked. Potters made pottery, weavers made cloth, builders built. Soldiers, once surplus grain existed worth defending or seizing, became a specialty of their own for arguably the first time in human history. And the moment your entire livelihood depends on one narrow skill, you become permanently dependent on everyone around you for the rest of what you actually need to survive. A skilled potter cannot simply decide one morning to go hunt dinner instead. That capability and the deeper knowledge behind it had already quietly atrophied through disuse, traded away without anyone framing it at the time as a trade at all. What got traded away in that whole process was not really comfort. It was autonomy, and it disappeared so gradually across so many separate generations that no single generation likely experienced it as a dramatic loss happening all at once, the way a person notices a sudden pay cut or an eviction notice. Foraging bands studied by anthropologists tend to share a consistent social pattern researchers call fierce egalitarianism, meaning no individual is allowed to accumulate lasting authority over anyone else in the group. If someone in a band tried repeatedly to boss others around, the group had simple, effective tools available: open mockery, quiet exclusion from shared food, or eventually the option to simply walk away and join a different band entirely. Settled agricultural life removed that last option almost entirely, since claimed land, stored surplus, and permanent structures made leaving dramatically more costly than it had ever been before. And once leaving stopped being a realistic option, hierarchy had room to take root and stay rooted. Early cities built on top of agricultural surplus formalized that hierarchy into something close to a permanent structure. Rulers, priests, and merchants sat at the top of it. Laborers, who physically produced most of the food and goods everyone else depended on, generally sat at the very bottom, working the hardest while owning the least, with essentially nowhere left to go once all the surrounding land had already been claimed by somebody else. This was not collaboration between equals. It was a durable power structure, and once it existed in one place, neighboring populations tended to adopt some version of it too, largely out of necessity, simply to remain competitive or defensible against groups that already had one. For most ordinary people living inside these early agricultural states, the working day stretched from sunrise until well past sunset, most days of the week, for essentially their entire adult life, with no real concept of a career, a promotion, or an eventual retirement waiting at the end of it. Work simply was existence, in a far more totalizing sense than even the most demanding modern job ever asks of anyone today. The version of work we would actually recognize today as a job, meaning labor cleanly separated from the rest of daily existence and measured out in fixed, standardized units, did not fully take shape until the Industrial Revolution. Historian E.P. Thompson wrote about this shift directly in his influential essay, Time, Work Discipline, and Industrial Capitalism, describing how earlier agricultural life ran largely on what he called task orientation, where work continued until a specific job, the harvest, the milking, the mending, was actually finished, regardless of what any clock happened to say at that particular moment. Factory labor demanded something categorically different, which Thompson called clock orientation, where time itself, rather than the completion of any particular task, became the actual unit being sold. Church bells, and later factory whistles mounted directly onto mill buildings, began dictating exactly when entire towns woke, ate, and worked, whether the task at hand was actually finished or not. Time clocks, mechanical devices workers physically punched a card into upon arriving and leaving, spread rapidly across factories precisely because owners needed a way to measure and enforce this new kind of time-based labor with total precision. Benjamin Franklin's own maxim that time is money, written generations earlier as a piece of individual advice about thrift, took on a far more literal and far less personal, meaning once factory owners began applying it directly to the hours of people who did not own the machines they operated, workers no longer sold grain, cloth, or finished goods. They sold measured blocks of their own time directly, often 10, 12, or 14 hours in a single day, inside buildings they did not own, producing goods they would frequently never personally use for wages that barely covered survival. Children worked extended shifts inside coal mines and textile mills. Adults lost fingers and worse to unguarded machinery, so routinely that it rarely made local news at all, since the entire economic model depended on treating that level of physical risk as an unavoidable operating cost, rather than something worth actually preventing. Nothing about that arrangement improved on its own. Labor unions organized and then repeatedly went on strike, sometimes facing direct violence from employers and from the state itself, to win concessions that today sound almost too basic to have ever required a fight. Weekends, a fixed 8-hour workday, and even minimal workplace safety standards. The standardized 40-hour work week, something now widely treated as barely sufficient to build a stable life around, was still considered a genuinely radical demand as recently as the 1920s in the United States, and it only became federal law toward the end of the 1930s. Generations after industrial labor itself had already become the norm for millions of working families. Those hard-won gains, though, quietly stopped advancing much further after they were achieved. Society rebuilt itself entirely around that 40-hour baseline. Mortgages, auto loans, insurance premiums, retirement contributions, all calculated on the assumption that steady, full-time paid work would simply continue indefinitely for decades. An assumption almost nobody living through it ever consciously agreed to in any formal sense. Yet, everyone quietly ended up structuring their entire adult life around anyway. Meanwhile, the actual output of that labor kept climbing sharply, without wages climbing anywhere near as fast alongside it. Economic researchers tracking net productivity in the United States since 1979 have documented output per worker rising by roughly 60%, while typical hourly pay over that same long stretch rose by well under 20%. Once adjusted for inflation, workers today are measurably producing more value per hour than at almost any earlier point in industrial history. Yet the actual hours required of them barely shrank at all, and the pay tied directly to producing all of that value stagnated noticeably behind it. Economists studying this widening gap generally point to a mix of causes. Weakened collective bargaining power as union membership declined sharply across the same decades, automation replacing entire categories of tasks without necessarily reducing the hours expected of the workers who remained, and a broader shift in how corporate profit itself gets distributed between shareholders and the people actually generating that profit on the floor or behind a desk. None of those explanations require imagining some secret conspiracy. They simply describe how a system, once its underlying incentives quietly shift, tends to keep producing the same widening outcome year after year without anyone individually steering it there on purpose. There is a quieter kind of evidence, too, buried much further back than any of this, that speaks directly to what genuinely unstructured time allows people to create when nothing is demanding it be spent otherwise. At Blombos Cave, along the southern coast of South Africa, archaeologists uncovered deliberately engraved pieces of ochre and carefully pierced shell beads dated to roughly 70,000 years old, made by people with no writing system, no agriculture, and certainly no employer of any kind. The engravings themselves follow a repeated, deliberate crosshatch pattern rather than random scratches, suggesting an intentional design rather than an accident of tool use, and the shell beads show wear patterns consistent with having been strung together and worn repeatedly against skin or clothing over an extended period. Nobody commissioned that engraved ochre. Nobody was paid in anything resembling a wage to string those shells together into personal ornaments. It only exists because somebody, at some point, had the uncommitted time and mental space available to make something whose entire purpose was meaning rather than survival, and chose to spend a portion of their day doing exactly that, decorating themselves or their surroundings for reasons that had nothing to do with keeping anyone fed. Some places have begun, in small and still fairly limited ways, to formally push back against the assumption that time belongs entirely to work by default. France passed a legal right to disconnect in 2017, giving employees at larger companies an actual legal basis to ignore work email and messages once they are off the clock, without facing retaliation of any kind for doing so. It is a modest legal step, and far from a full return to anything resembling foraging life. But it exists precisely because, Enough people recognized that the current default, being reachable at essentially all hours, regardless of the actual time, had quietly become normal without anyone ever really choosing it collectively along the way. Other countries have since debated similar measures of their own, and a handful of companies have experimented independently with shortened 4-day work weeks, generally reporting that measured output held steady or even improved slightly, which raises an uncomfortable question about how much of the traditional 40-hour standard was ever actually necessary for the work itself, as opposed to simply being inherited from an era that measured commitment by hours logged rather than by anything genuinely produced. And that gets at something worth sitting with directly. Ask most adults today an ordinary opening question at a party, and the very first thing out of their mouth after their name is almost always what they do for a living, not what they are curious about, not what they are actually good at, or what genuinely makes a day feel worth having lived through. What they do for money, as though that single detail somehow explains the rest of who they are, lose that job unexpectedly, and plenty of people report a real, disorienting sense of having lost their entire identity right along with it, not merely their income. Researchers who study unemployment and mental health have consistently found that the damage runs well beyond the obvious financial strain, touching daily structure, social connection, and a person's basic sense of purpose all at once, precisely because so much of that had been quietly outsourced to a job title in the first place, rather than built and maintained independently of it. For roughly 290,000 of the nearly 300,000 years our species has existed, that entire connection between identity and employment simply did not exist. Because employment itself did not exist. People had skills, people had responsibilities to their band and to each other. What they very rarely had was a boss, a fixed schedule, or a job title standing in for the whole of who they actually were. Jobs, in the specific, rigid, clock-measured form we now treat as an unquestioned fact of adult life, are a remarkably recent arrangement layered onto a much older, much more flexible way of living, not some permanent, unavoidable feature of being human at all. None of this means agriculture, cities, or industry were mistakes. They made larger populations, medicine, and the very comfort most of us rely on, daily, genuinely possible, in ways a small foraging band never could have supported on its own. The point is narrower and, in some ways, more useful than a simple verdict of good or bad. Every one of those advances arrived bundled together with a specific, largely unexamined cost, measured in hours, autonomy, and unstructured time, and very few people across that entire multi-thousand-year stretch ever actually got to vote on whether that particular bundle was worth accepting as a package deal. We did not trade unstructured time away for civilization itself. We traded it away for accumulation, for surplus, for the particular kind of security that comes bundled with owning things, and we are still, generation after generation, quietly working to buy back the very thing that arrangement first required us to give up.